when 78-year-old Harold Poot walked into the Naval Aviation Heritage Hangar in Pensacola, Florida. He was wearing a faded denim jacket, orthopedic shoes, and a bull cap so sun-bleached you couldn't read the patch on the front anymore. He moved slowly, the way men move when their knees have filed formal complaints with the rest of the body. He didn't sign the guest book. He didn't ask for a tour. He just stood in the doorway of that massive hangar, looked up at the F-14, a Tomcat suspended on jack stands under banks of fluorescent lights, and for just a moment his eyes changed. Something behind them shifted. Something old and deep and full of memory. If you believe that the people who built this country deserve to be remembered, comment the word respect right now and stay with me, because what happened next in that hangar changed every single person who witnessed it. The Naval Aviation Heritage Hangar was one of those passion projects that existed because a handful of retired officers and aviation enthusiasts refused to let history rot in a barnyard. The centerpiece of the restoration was Bureau No. 162710, an F-14, a Tomcat that had seen combat in Operation Desert Storm, had flown off the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and had eventually been stripped for parts at Davis-Empton before being rescued by the Foundation 3 years earlier. The project was overseen by Commander David Chen, retired, a former F-14 pilot himself, who had flown Tomcats in the final years of the platform before the Navy retired the airframe in 2006. Chen had assembled a team of 12 volunteer mechanics, most of them younger aviation technicians and a few engineering students from the local university who wanted hands-on experience with legacy military hardware. The goal was a full cosmetic and partial mechanical restoration, getting the aircraft to a condition where every system that could safely operate on the ground would operate. Hydraulics, flight controls, radar sweep, the works. It was ambitious, it was expensive, and for the past 3 weeks it had been stuck. The problem was the hydraulic system. The F-14's hydraulics were notoriously complex. A dual-system architecture that powered everything from the variable geometry wing sweep to the landing gear to the flight control surfaces. The team had rebuilt both hydraulic pumps, replaced every seal and line they could source, bled the system twice, and still couldn't get consistent pressure to the portside flight control actuator. The gauges would climb to operating pressure, hold for about 40 seconds, then slowly bleed down. No visible leaks, no obvious failures. 3 weeks of troubleshooting, and they were starting to talk about whether the actuator housing itself was cracked internally, which would mean sourcing a part that essentially didn't exist anymore outside of Iranian Air Force stocks. Harold Poot didn't know any of that when he walked in. Or maybe he knew all of it just by listening. He stood near the nose of the aircraft for a few minutes watching the team work. Then he walked slowly along the port side, his eyes tracking the underside of the fuselage, the way a doctor's eyes track a patient's body during an examination. He paused near the engine cell where access panels had been removed to expose the complex arterial network of hydraulic lines, wiring bundles, and pneumatic tubing that kept the Tomcat alive. He leaned in close. He reached up and touched a bundle of wiring that ran along the upper cell wall, gently pressing it aside with 2 fingers to look at something behind it. That's when Kyle Mercer noticed him. Kyle was 26, a licensed A&P mechanic who worked at a regional airline during the week and volunteered at the hangar on weekends. He was good at his job, confident in his skills, and deeply protective of the aircraft he considered his responsibility. He saw an old man in street clothes with his hands inside an open engine cell on a military aircraft, and he reacted the way any responsible technician would. He crossed the hangar floor in about 4 strides. Sir, you need to step back from the aircraft. This is a restricted restoration area." Harold pulled his hand back slowly and looked at Kyle. He didn't say anything. Kyle pointed toward the visitors area near the front of the hangar. "There's an information desk up front if you want a brochure, but you can't be touching the aircraft. This isn't a petting zoo." A couple of the other volunteers looked over. One of them, a university student named Ree, smirked. Harold nodded once quietly, the way a man nods when he's heard something he's heard 1,000 times before. "I understand," he said. His voice was soft, a little growly, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been used sparingly for a long time. He took a step back from the Nell, then he took another. He stood there for a moment looking at the aircraft, and then he turned and walked slowly toward a metal folding chair near the wall and sat down. He sat there for almost 20 minutes watching. Not the way a tourist watches, the way a surgeon watches another surgeon operate. His eyes followed every move the team made, every tool they picked up, every panel they removed. Twice his lips moved slightly as if he were about to say something, but he stopped himself. He just watched. And then the main hangar door opened and Commander David Chen walked in carrying a box of replacement fittings he'd driven 2 hours to pick up from a surplus dealer in Mobile. He set the box on a workbench, exchanged a few words with his team lead, and then turned to scan the hangar the way he always did. A quick visual inventory of people, tools, and progress. His eyes reached Harold Poot sitting in the folding chair, and he stopped moving completely. The box of fittings he'd just set down started to slide off the edge of the bench, and he didn't notice. His face lost color the way a screen loses brightness when the power cuts. His mouth opened. He took 3 steps toward Harold, then stopped again, as if his legs had briefly forgotten how to sequence the act of walking. "Chief Root," he said, his voice cracked on the second word. Every person in that hangar turned to look at him. David Chen had a reputation as one of the most composed officers anyone had ever served under. He didn't crack. He didn't raise his voice. He certainly didn't stare at elderly visitors like he'd seen a ghost. Harold looked up from the folding chair. He squinted slightly the way people do when they're trying to match a face to a memory file decades ago. "Do I know you, son?" he asked. Chen walked closer. His hands were shaking. "Sir Chief Poot, I'm David Chen. Lieutenant Chen, VF-32. I was in your shop in 1991. Harold's expression shifted. The squint softened into recognition. "Little Chen," he said quietly. "The kid who cross-threaded a bleed fitting on a hydraulic test stand and thought nobody noticed." Chen let out a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. "You noticed, Chief. You always noticed." The hangar had gone completely silent. Kyle Mercer was standing 6 feet away, still holding a wrench, looking back and forth between the old man in the folding chair and the commander who looked like he was about to either salute or cry. Chen turned to face the team. When he spoke, his voice had shifted into something harder, something with command authority wrapped around it, like rebar inside concrete. "Listen to me carefully, every single one of you. This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Harold Poot, United States Navy, retired. He served 31 years as an aviation structural and hydraulic systems technician. He was the lead hydraulic systems technician for Fighter Squadron 32, the swordsman aboard the USS John F. Kennedy and later the Theodore Roosevelt. He maintained F-14 Tomcats in combat during Operation Desert Storm, Operation Southern Watch, and Operation Enduring Freedom." Chen paused to let that settle. Then he continued. "Senior Chief Poot was one of the primary contributors to Navy Technical Manual 01 F-1422, which is the hydraulic systems maintenance manual for the F-42A and F-14B aircraft. When I say he contributed to the manual, I don't mean he proofread it. I mean Grumman engineers consulted him because he understood systems on this aircraft that the people who designed them had lost track of. He is, as far as I know, one of the last living maintenance technicians who worked the F-14 hydraulic system from the original fleet introduction in 1974 through the final retirement in 2006. Chen turned back to Harold. "Chief, I want you to have full and unrestricted access to this aircraft. Every panel, every system, every tool in this hangar is at your disposal, and I want every person on this team to listen to every single word you say as if their careers depend on it." He paused. "Because if they'd been in my Navy, their careers would have depended on it." Kyle Mercer's wrench hand dropped to his side. His face had gone through a sequence of expressions that started at confusion, passed through disbelief, and arrived at something that looked very much like shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Harold Poot stood up from the folding chair slowly, pressing one hand on his knee for leverage. He looked at Chen for a long moment. "You were a good pilot, Lieutenant, even when you were green." Then he turned and walked back toward the port side, and this time nobody told him to stop. He stood in front of the open access panel for about 90 seconds. Not touching anything, just looking. Then he asked very quietly, "What's she doing?" Chen explained the problem. "Pressure building to spec, holding for roughly 40 seconds, then bleeding down on the portside flight control actuator. No visible leaks, all seals replaced, both pumps rebuilt." Harold nodded slowly. He asked for a flashlight. Someone handed him one instantly. He leaned into the Necessal, moving the same wiring bundle aside that he'd been examining earlier before Kyle had stopped him. He followed a hydraulic line with the flashlight beam, tracing it from the pump output manifold along its routing path toward the actuator. He stopped at a junction block mounted to the airframe about 18 in after the wing pivot point. He studied it for about 2 minutes. Then he said, "Hand me a 10mm combination wrench and a mirror." Someone produced both within seconds. He positioned the mirror behind the junction block and angled the flashlight. Then he made a sound, a quiet sound, almost like a teacher discovering exactly the mistake he expected to find on a student's exam. "Your problem isn't the actuator," he said, "and it isn't the pump, and it isn't the seals." He pointed with the wrench at the junction block. "This is a Series 4 junction block. This aircraft should have a Series 6. The difference is the internal check valve seat angle. Series 4 is 17 degrees. Series 6 is 22 degrees at ambient temperature. A Series 4 will seat and hold pressure just fine. But when the fluid comes up to operating temperature, the thermal expansion of the valve seat changes the geometry just enough that it can't maintain a full seal. You get a slow internal bypass. Pressure builds, holds while the fluid is still coming up to temp, then bleeds off once thermal equilibrium is reached." He pulled back from the NL. "Somebody installed the wrong junction block. Probably came out of a parts bin that wasn't segregated properly. The part numbers are almost identical. Difference is 1 digit in the dash number. Easy mistake if you don't know what you're looking for." 4 minutes. 4 minutes from the moment he asked what the problem was to the moment he diagnosed it. 3 weeks of work by 12 people. And this man in a faded denim jacket and orthopedic shoes had found it in 4 minutes with a flashlight and a mirror. The hangar was silent again. But it was a different kind of silent. Not the confused silence of before. This was the silence of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Kyle Mercer walked up to Harold. His jaw was tight. His eyes were glassy. "Chief Root, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was out of line, and I'm sorry." Harold looked at him. Harold. There was no anger in his expression, no smugness, just the steady, patient look of a man who had spent 31 years teaching young people how to keep aircraft in the sky, and had learned that the best ones were always the ones who could admit when they were wrong. "You were doing your job," Harold said. "You saw someone where they shouldn't be, and you acted. That's not something to apologize for. That's something to build on." He paused. "But next time, maybe ask a question before you give an order. You might be surprised what the answer is." Over the following weeks, Harold Poot became a regular presence in the hangar. He came every Tuesday and Thursday, arriving at 8:00 in the morning with a thermos of black coffee and a small leather notebook that turned out to contain decades of handwritten technical notes, system quirks, field modifications, and diagnostic procedures that existed nowhere else, not in any manual, not in any database, not in any archive. Knowledge that lived only in that notebook and in the mind of the man who wrote it. He worked with the team patiently, methodically, teaching them things about the F-14 that no classroom and no technical order could convey. He showed them how to listen to the aircraft, how to feel a hydraulic line for the subtle vibration that indicated a partially restricted orifice, how to read the pattern of fluid weep on a seal face to determine whether the failure was pressure-induced or age-related. He taught them the language of the machine. Commander Chen contacted the National Naval Aviation Museum and the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum and arranged to have Harold's notebook digitized and archived as a primary source document for F-14 maintenance history. The Naval History and Heritage Command recorded a formal oral history interview with Harold spanning 9 hours across 3 sessions, preserving first-hand accounts of carrier aviation, maintenance operations across 3 decades, and multiple combat deployments. The foundation named the restoration project the Poot Restoration in his honor, and a small brass plaque was mounted on the hangar wall near the aircraft bearing his name, rank, and years of service. Kyle Mercer became one of Harold's most dedicated students. He spent hours after the other volunteers had gone home, sitting with Harold while the old man walked him through system diagrams and told stories about midnight maintenance on a pitching flight deck in the Persian Gulf, about the pressure of knowing that if you made a mistake, a pilot didn't come home. Kyle later said that those conversations changed his understanding of what it meant to be a mechanic. That it wasn't just about knowing procedures, but about understanding that every bolt and every wire and every fitting was a link in a chain that connected directly to a human life. He said Harold taught him that the most important tool a mechanic has isn't in any toolbox. It's humility. Harold Poot passed away 14 months later quietly at home with his leather notebook on the nightstand beside him. Commander Chen delivered the eulogy. The restored F-14 Bureau number 162710 was completed 6 months after that. Fully operational on the ground, every system functional, hydraulics holding perfect pressure. On the day of the public unveiling, every member of the restoration team stood at attention beside the aircraft. Kyle Mercer was at the front. He was wearing a new ball cap. On it was stitched the same patch that had been on Harold's faded cap, the one Tucson bleached to read the day he first walked into the hangar. VF-32, the swordsman. Chen had tracked down the patch and given it to Kyle. He would have wanted you to have it, Chen told him. Kyle wore it every day. He worked in that hangar for the rest of his life. There's a certain kind of man who builds things and fixes things and keeps things running. And he does it so quietly and so well that the world forgets he's there. He doesn't ask for recognition. He doesn't demand respect. He just shows up, does the work, and goes home. And when he's gone, you realize that everything he touched still works. And everything he taught still matters. And the silence he left behind is louder than anything you've ever heard. If you believe that the quiet ones deserve to be remembered, subscribe to this channel, because these are the stories we tell here. The ones the world forgot about the people it shouldn't.